We are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
And looking ahead to what is next.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?
Good afternoon, my name is Mary Eccles and I'm a health reporter at Politico. You're watching Politico Live, the live extension of our non-partisan journalism. This session focuses on patient access to sustainable medicines. So drug shortages aren't a new thing in Europe, but the COVID pandemic demonstrated how bad things can get when demand for medicine surges and supply chains are interrupted. Last year, European countries suffered shortages of antibiotics like amoxicillin and painkillers like paracetamol, while 95% of hospital pharmacists reported shortages. Some EU countries introduced emergency measures like temporary export halts to deal with their own national issues, something which didn't go down very well at the time with the then European Health Commissioner. To help deal with the problem, the European Commission announced that it would come forward with the Critical Medicines Act, aimed at shoring up Europe's supply of critical drugs that would otherwise put patients' lives at risk. And that's the one new policy proposal that the new European Health Commissioner, Oliver Varhelyi, says he would like to prioritise, hoping to announce it within the first 100 days of his mandate. In the meantime, the Commission has gathered industry, civil society and governments to come up with their own recommendations through the Critical Medicines Alliance, whose suggestions will feed into the Act. At the tail end of last year, the Commission and the European Medicines Agency also drew up a list of 200 critical medicines in a bid to ensure the security of its supply. So that's where we are on a policy front. But first things first, some housekeeping remarks. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Zentiva, for making this event possible, and a warm thank you to our audience for joining us all online. We want to make this event as interactive as possible, so you can participate by tweeting about it at @LivePolitico and ask questions through Slido using #SustainableMedicine. You know who we are, obviously, and so we want to know who you are too, so we'll be prioritising questions sent with a name and organisation. And you can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll presented by Zentiva, who are asking, do you believe the current systemic framework applied to the generics industry is sustainable and effectively ensures the availability and accessibility of medicines for patients across the EU? So we'll look at the results at the end of our panel. But before we dive into that, I'll give the floor to Ines Windisch, who's the Head of Communications, Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Zentiva.
And good afternoon. It's a privilege to welcome you in this important discussion on the future of healthcare in Europe, a topic that is not only close to my heart, but also crucial for the well-being of millions across our continent. My name is Ines Windisch and I'm the Head of Communications, Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Zentiva. At Zentiva, we are incredibly proud to sponsor this event today. We believe that fostering an open dialogue and collaboration is so essential to addressing the challenges we face as an industry. Before we dive into the panel discussion, I would like to share some key points that highlight the urgency and importance of today's conversation. 70% of medicines dispensed in Europe are generics, and 9 out of 10 of the critical medicine list are generics as well. These figures highlight the crucial role of the pharmaceutical industry, specifically the generics industry, in safeguarding the health of millions across Europe. As highlighted in the Draghi report, it is imperative that Europe remains competitive on the global stage. Our healthcare system is unique, with high standards and a commitment to leaving no one behind. This means ensuring that healthcare is accessible to all who need it, and that medicines are available to those who depend on them every day. Europe has a long tradition of pharma manufacturing, and the pharmaceutical industry must return back home to Europe. The European Green Deal aims to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, an urgent and at the same time inspiring objective. However, implementing it in the generics industry, a sector that already is bounded by strict regulation and price caps, is anything but straightforward. The implementation is complicated and requires high cost and resource demand. It widens the gap between regulatory demands and the realities of producing affordable generics. While our industry is committed to complying with the regulations and contributing to the ambitious goals of the European Union and its green targets, the systemic framework we are operating in needs a health check. We see a growing wave of member state market separation, yet medicines are not produced for one country alone. Plants in the European Union supply medicines to multiple nations. What we need are harmonized European-wide frameworks. This is especially critical as we discussed incentivizing European production under the Critical Medicines Act. Reshoring production back to Europe is essential for resilience, but we cannot compete with Asia without significant investments into innovative technologies and processes and simpler approaches instead of unnecessary administrative burden. Key to this transformation might be value-added medicines, so-called VAMs, which improve existing treatments to make them safer and more effective while reducing their environmental impact. Greener chemistry innovations can lead to breakthrough production processes that align with both environmental and economic priorities. However, till now, we do not see any regulatory framework supporting these innovations appropriately. The current system fails to recognize and appraise these efforts. On a larger scale, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive is hard to digest. Despite serious concerns from more than half of the member states, the directive passed and is now in implementation, risking the availability of generic medicines. For us as an industry, it becomes economically unviable to manufacture certain products or even invest into additional production capacity in Europe. A lot of these hurdles require time to overcome, but there are practical, actionable steps we can take immediately. For example, transitioning to digital leaflets could eliminate thousands of tons of paper waste per producer annually. This not only benefits the environment, but also facilitates faster movement of medicines, especially in hospital or care centers, where medication is in the hands of hospital personnel who can benefit from accessible information from everywhere and in all languages. We need solutions, we need collaboration, we must be open-minded. That's why we are conducting the European Health Check today. Generics are not just a cost-saving measure, they are a lifeline for millions of people in Europe. Let us ensure they remain available, affordable, and sustainable, and resilient for generations to come. In closing, I would like to challenge all the speakers today to share at least one concrete action they believe will help Europe ensure sustainable healthcare for the future. Let's make our discussions today not just theoretical, but a catalyst for a real, impactful change. Thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thanks for those insightful remarks. Let's get right into it now then with our expert lineup for the day. So joining us today, we have Gloria Gaquier, an advisor on European affairs at the Cabinet of Deputy Prime Minister Frank van den Broek of Belgium, who also obviously worked as a health minister until very recently. Adrian van den Hoven, the Director General of Medicines for Europe. Billy Callagher, an MEP from the Renew Group, an Irish MEP who is a substitute in the Sant Committee, and Vanessa Bennett, we have from the European Medicines Agency, who is the Senior Medicines and Medical Device Shortages Specialist. Thanks each of you for joining us here today. To kick things off, I wondered maybe if I could come to you, Vanessa. I wondered, first of all, perhaps if you could kind of set the scene for us a little bit. I wanted to get an understanding of what the scale of the current drug challenges are in Europe. I know, obviously, off the back of the pandemic, that was kind of seen maybe as the peak. But I wondered perhaps if you could, put it into context a little bit, what are the shortages today, or what's the scale of the shortages today, and kind of what are the main drivers of those shortages too?
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to kick off and set the context a little bit. So maybe I think it might be useful to look at the framework we have and that we use at the moment at EU level, but also at national level across Europe. So the systems we have in place are, I suppose, almost in three baskets. So there is a reactive approach whereby shortages are notified to either national competent authorities in the member states or to the European Medicines Agency, and engaging with companies to identify mitigation measures and resolve those shortages as quickly as possible. So it's really taking it as it comes and having a process to react. And for that process, there is a group of experts across the EU who form the SPOC working party. So this is a single point of contact working party. There is then the next level up, which is an executive group called the MSSG. So in instances where shortages can't be resolved at national level, or where when it's brought to union level through the SPOC working party, there are still outstanding challenges that really need further attention. They go to the SPOC or to the MSSG, apologies, for deeper discussion, often engagement with the companies at that level to really work towards a plan to resolve those shortages, to get supply back to the market, to the health systems and patients. That work is, as I said, reactive, but also preparedness. So it's in essence, if there is a potential shortage coming, or if there's an issue that affects multiple member states, there can be a coordinated approach to prepare and aim to prevent, of course, shortages. On the other side, we are looking and shifting very much towards preventative model. So I think this is maybe more so the focus of the discussion today, in terms of how can we look at critical medicines, as was mentioned. So the idea of medicines that are most critical for health systems. So not crisis specific, but very much at all times, what are the medicines that are needed for the good functioning of health systems in Europe? And as we have published a union list, as was said, with the EMA, the European Commission, and the member states through the heads of medicines agencies. And that initial list was published last year. There will be an update to that list this year, and this is all included in the proposed pharmaceutical legislation. So I think this is a very important point. We have already a mandate at EMA for the coordinated approach, but that will be extended through the proposed pharmaceutical legislation. And also we will have this additional preventative arm with respect to the critical medicines. What is key, and I think what links to some of this discussion later on, is we don't just have this list, but in the proposed pharmaceutical legislation, there is a process to look at the supply chains of those critical medicines and to actually identify vulnerabilities. And this is really, really a critical element in prevention. So the information, of course, will come from the companies because they understand their supply chains, of course, from the companies. And we have a tool at EMA. It's called the European Shortages Monitoring Platform. It's a key tool. It's under development, but this tool will serve as a point of gathering information, but also allowing for analysis of information. And this is really essential, because understanding the vulnerabilities of the critical medicines is key to actually addressing the challenges and really having a targeted and very focused approach on where the problems lie. So, of course, in the proposed pharmaceutical legislation, we have a process for recommendations within the regulatory sphere, but then as with shortages, supply chain challenges are multifactorial, incredibly complex, and therefore the solutions are also multifactorial and incredibly complex. So all of the answers don't sit within this regulatory space, but we also need to look towards industrial policy solutions, for example. And I think that that explains where we're headed, I think.
Thanks very much for that initial overview. I'd like to turn to you now, Gloria, to get a sense of kind of how this plays out very practically on a country level. I was just wondering, like, at what point would the Belgian Health Ministry, for example, find out about a specific shortage? Are there enough warning systems in place? And how do you go about on a national level ensuring you're able to access more stock or access alternative drugs if you need to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the Belgian ministry finds out the moment that a company notifies shortage, right? So we have a platform for that. It's called Pharma Status. And if we really have signals from the ground that there's no real alternative available, or if we don't have enough supply of the alternative, we kind of establish task forces with doctors, specialists, pharmacists, hospitals, the cabinet also, the medicines agency, to try to resolve the problem on our own. So, for instance, we try to find alternative treatments, or we try to find out if certain treatments can be postponed. If all of this doesn't work, that's when we usually turn to the European level, because it means that we have a critical shortage at the level, member state level. Sorry, what was the second question again?
It was more about understanding if there's kind of like enough of a warning system in place. I mean, one thing I've heard when I spoke with, doctors, for example, was they said, oh, we often just find out about the shortage when, a patient comes in, asks us for something, we try and prescribe it, and then it doesn't come up on our system anymore. Or the patients sometimes only find out about it, when they go to the pharmacy, don't actually, are told you can't access the drug because we don't have it. And sort of that's how the information's filtered down on a very practical level. So I was just wondering, if kind of how it worked at a national level, and whether there were maybe better ways of informing each other, the different stakeholders of informing each other if there are, concerns that there might be a shortage on the way.
Okay, well, so there is already a notification obligation at the European level. When you foresee a disruption or a shortage, you have to notify a few months beforehand, depending on the type of disruption that there is. Now, I have to admit that sometimes we are confronted with a shortage that is notified by a patient that doesn't immediately show up on our platform, Pharma Status. So there seems to be a bit of a delay between the moment that the patient starts finding out about the shortage and the moment that we are officially notified. That's not always the case, but it has happened before. In Belgium, the way to resolve shortages, it's really often the pharmacists who play a critical role in this, because it will be the pharmacist then in the end giving the alternative treatment to the patient. Usually doctors should also be aware through their representatives who are represented in the stakeholder group that there is a shortage. But of course, it's very difficult, or sometimes the information flow can be a bit suboptimal,
So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that the Commission is trying to deal with the problem on a industrial level has been to set up this Critical Medicines Alliance, which brings together civil society, governments, industry to suggest recommendations. Adrian, obviously, you sit on that alliance. I just wondered, could you tell us how the work's been progressing so far? Any sense of what recommendations might look like?
Well, it's still a work in progress, but I have to say that the alliance is working quite well. There's a lot of time pressure. Even before the announcement that this would be done in the first 100 days, there was already quite a bit of time pressure. So that, let's say, increases that. But what I would say is there's really a constructive dialogue between the different stakeholders. Most of the working groups are led by different member state representatives from different countries. And they're working on a series of issues. But I can say the ones that have advanced the most in the dialogue so far, one is looking at ways to incentivize generic and active pharmaceutical ingredients manufacturing in Europe, recognizing that the trend has been for manufacturing to move to Asian countries over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years. But Europe still has capabilities, and most European member states still actually produce generic medicines or APIs. So scaling this back up in Europe to, let's say, for our strategic autonomy, which is the term that's used, is something that is underway. And it's really about how you can either use tax incentives or EU funds to support this. Second key area that's looked at is how do you reward security of supply and resilience in the purchasing of medicines? So the main focus is on procurement, probably because a lot of hospital medicines are procured through public procurement. And well, it's quite well known that most procurement is based on lowest price with very little on security of supply. So the idea is to introduce some kind of criteria that would reward companies that invest in security of supply and resilience in procurement markets, which would be quite a change to the European market if that would be applied. And the third area has already been discussed a little bit. It's in the industry, how we see shortages or solving shortages is to move product where you have excess supply to where you have the shortage, because most shortages in Europe are still localized in individual member states. I think the challenge that we are facing is that European, let's say, harmonization legislation is not necessarily moving forward very quickly. So all the aspects of, say, moving towards digital leaflets or towards harmonized packaging are quite slow and difficult and probably won't happen for quite a few years down the road. But we see that some member states, especially big member states like France and Germany, are introducing stockpiling requirements, which means that you have to keep a big stock of medicines, say, in Germany. And if there's a shortage in a country next to Germany, like for gloria's sake, say Belgium, you can't use that stock and send it to Belgium. So that's really a challenge, I think, that we're seeing coming up, and it's also under discussion in the Critical Medicines Alliance.
Thanks. And yeah, I think we'll come back to the stockpiling issue a little later. But first, I wanted to bring in Billy. So obviously, at the moment, the Alliance has been working with national governments, but I wanted to get a sense from you what you see as being the role for the European Parliament in helping with this issue. What would be your priority as someone in the SAND committee pushing to help mitigate shortages in the coming mandate?
Well, look, it's a very critical issue. I mean, everybody is very concerned about the situation in Europe with regard to critical medicines and the shortage of same. You know, Europe has been a cold place for some time in terms of supporting the pharmaceutical industry and the development of medicines in general, but specifically here with regard to generics. We've been outsourcing active ingredients for a long time, and I think that the war in Ukraine, but more previous to that, the Suez Canal incident, you know, COVID itself, they all indicated that we have very vulnerable supply lines in terms of active ingredients for medicine production within the European Union itself. So we have two problems. We have active ingredients that are all mainly sourced outside Europe, and we have been diminishing our own capacity in Europe. What COVID did show, though, which was very interesting, was that with an emergency, we were able to unleash a lot of capacity in a short space of time when we put our mind to it, both in terms of speeding up decision-making process with regards to the regulatory environment, but also by supporting it through financial supports, research and development, and actually the manufacturing of vaccines itself as well. But from my perspective, I mean, the pharmaceutical strategy, the Critical Medicines Act, the monitoring systems that are being established by the European Medicines Agency, they are all a very important component in where we want to get to, which is ensuring that we're no longer vulnerable to international shocks. Like, we were very vulnerable when it came to the invasion of Ukraine with regard to gas and energy. And the idea that we could drift to a situation where we wouldn't have the capacity to provide medicines for the citizens of the European Union, not because we couldn't afford to, but because we had outsourced and we had made Europe a cold place in terms of production of generics. So I think we have to do a number of things. We have to resolve the immediate issues around the critical medicines and the shortages of same. But I think in tandem with that, we have to insist on having a development of policies that reinvigorates the generic production within the European Union that ensure, that might have to be carrot and stick. And that's a key area. The other area that I think we have a major problem with, of course, is the single market itself and the concept of the single market. When it comes to critical medicines, of course, you're going to have some countries that have the capacity to store and to hoard medicines that are short. They may not necessarily need them immediately, but it means that there's some other country within the European Union short. So I think we have to have a greater collaboration across the European Union. While we do have shortages, that we have a burden sharing in terms of making sure that medicines are sent to where they're needed, rather than they being hoarded and stored by departments of health and governments across Europe as well. It's just a symptom of the fear that governments have around the issue of actually running out of medicines. And we have a huge challenge across Europe. Even in Ireland, we have major challenges in getting just some very basic medicines, and that is a significant. Just to recap, we need to address the issues of supply chains, reshore active ingredients, incentivize generics. Let's be honest, I mean, a lot of the reason too is, of course, there's very little profitability in generics. Regulation is causing challenges. Well, we heard with regard to the wastewater directive and other significant issues. So, like Draghi and the report talks about these issues, and what Europe has to do now is to reinvigorate and reinvent Europe around the issue of innovation and making sure that we're competitive. And that means that a lot of companies that are looking at Asia, for example, for manufacturing, may start to manufacture here in Europe. We have the ability. What we need now is the policies to underpin it.
We talk a lot about the Critical Medicines Act as in the health policy world, obviously, and we know now that it's going to be dealt with by the Health Commissioner. But there's obviously a big industrial policy component to it as well. From a pure health policy perspective, the pharma legislation also had proposals related to mitigating drug shortages. Vanessa, do you see those measures helping? And also, was there anything that you'd like to have seen within the proposal to help with drug shortages that perhaps wasn't, and I suppose still potentially could be included, since it's still being discussed in the council, since they haven't come up with their position yet?
Thank you. Well, with respect to what's already included, I think we can say it really reflects the current processes. So as I said, we have this SPOC working party, we have the MSSG. So what's set out in the proposal with respect to shortages and the management of critical shortages is really reflected there. What it does is it adds additional obligations on companies to provide information, and it also adds the possibility for MSSG recommendations beyond what we already have. So I think in terms of the flexibility and what it allows, I think it really, for the management of critical shortages, it really sets the scene and provides the additional information. And it also includes the extension of our European shortages monitoring platform, which is of course a key component to ensure that we have the correct data and we can use it appropriately. What the proposal adds, and this is what I said earlier, is this new component on prevention. And I think this is really critical. I mean, it's as we're talking about supply chains, we're talking about how we can reinforce, support and strengthen the supply and continuity of supply of medicines for EU health systems and patients. And that, I think, is really set out in the proposal with respect to the establishment of the union list and the identification of vulnerabilities. So for me, that having that focus, having the access to the information to identify where the real problems lie, so the MSSG recommendations can really target those vulnerabilities, is absolutely key. I would say what's missing is something that doesn't belong in this proposal. It's the additional elements. So we work with a toolkit within the regulatory sphere. We will deploy all of those tools, of course, to address the challenges, but these challenges are often go beyond the regulatory sphere. And so for me, what's missing is the industrial policy piece. And I think, as I said, it doesn't sit in the proposed pharmaceutical legislation, but hopefully we will see that addressed through the planned Critical Medicines Act.
And obviously it was Belgium who really pushed for the Act originally. So I kind of wanted to come to you now, Gloria, and ask, what do you really want to see in that Act, which was supposed to be coming out by the end of February?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe if I can talk about the case that was the direct cause of the Act. We have two cases that were the direct cause of the Act. One was a thrombolytics shortage, where Belgium was very dependent on a very small producer of thrombolytics who had run into production problems and who did not want to make the investment anymore to restart production. So we've had thrombolytics problems for about a year and a half now. On the other hand, you could see that the other producer of thrombolytics was a very large producer, which cornered like a large part of the global supply. And this points towards two problems in the ecosystem. On the one hand, you have large consolidation in the generic sector, and this causes some sort of dependency, but also some sort of vulnerability towards, for instance, increased global demand. If there is an increased demand in the US, Europe will feel it. So that's one part. And another part is that within this ecosystem, there are also a lot of producers, smaller producers, which are working with older facilities, let's say, who should be able to modernize their facilities. And then secondly, we had a case of amoxicillin, which was being produced in Europe. It's one of the last antibiotics production plants in Europe, but which ran into financial problems. And the Austrian government had put forward a public-private investment plan, which was for a very long time at first rejected by the European Commission. But then, well, it was a long negotiation, let's say that. It was a very long negotiation to get this partnership through. And it points towards the need for tailored state aid instruments and tailored investment instruments into this industry so that you can ensure that you have a diverse range of suppliers and that you have modernized production facilities and that you can build public-private partnerships. I think this is one of the key elements of the Critical Medicines Act. It's to build the right tools for the generics industry in Europe and for critical medicines in Europe. Another part is that if we invest in European medicines, then we should have a sustainable market that also buys these medicines. And there, I think some European action on public procurement, some harmonization on public procurement rules, to make sure that public procurement takes into account the criticality of the product, the production methods, the question whether it was sustainably produced. Even for some medicines, I would say whether it was produced in Europe, I would not be scared of that. But to have public procurement rules which are really an incentive for the industry here. I think these are the main elements.
Just touching a little on what you said there around kind of sustainability within procurement anyway. I mean, one of the, not necessarily concerns, I'd say, but thoughts would be that bringing drug production to Europe would obviously mean sort of higher labour costs and environmental standards. Adrian, do you think it's possible to shore up our drug supply without increasing prices for patients?
Well, I think it's possible to do it without increasing prices for patients because most of these critical medicines are reimbursed or are dispensed in a hospital setting, where typically in Europe, the patient contributes only a small amount, let's say. Of course, the bigger question is, will it impact public health insurance, which most countries have? I think there will be a cost. I think there's a cost to security. There's a cost to reducing the number of shortages we are facing, because it's very clear that let's say the shortages and the consolidation of the market that Gloria was talking about are very clearly linked. 2/3 of the shortages of generic medicines in Europe are on these highly consolidated products that was already mentioned. So this is very clearly established. I think, though, you need to look at these costs in the relative scheme of things. So all generic medicines, which are 70% of the prescriptions, only account for 20% of the pharmaceutical budget. That's maybe 3 or 4% of healthcare budgets. So and then if you take the critical medicines list, this is even dramatically smaller share of the pharmaceutical budget. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly what it is, but it would be really a small chunk of the pharmaceutical budget. So if we are looking at increasing the cost of what is a very tiny share of the pharmaceutical or the healthcare budget in order to guarantee our security of supply, to reduce shortages, or to be ready in case of war or in case of some kind of major crisis like another pandemic, it seems like money, relatively small amount of money well spent.
Thanks. I want to bring in some of our questions now that we're getting from Slido, perhaps this one from an anonymous person, unfortunately, but they say, could there be a better way to communicate shortages to the public and ensure transparency over availability of medicines? Perhaps, Billy, do you have any thoughts on that about how better to communicate shortages to the public?
Well, the European Shortages Monitoring Platform, for example, I think is a start in assessing what is and what isn't, in terms of scarcity, we actually have lifetime information as to what is available and what isn't available. And this is obviously for a number of reasons, but to ensure that, in prescribing, that we know what can be prescribed, because there's not much point in prescribing a medicine that is not available. And on top of that then is obviously health services, GP services, pharmacists, can at least plan with some degree of certainty about when a medicine could become available to them. But I think the broader issue here is, look, the challenge we have is we talk about consolidation of the generics business as such. Things consolidate when margins are very tight. That is a market fact. So when margins are exceptionally tight, there's a consolidation. And then on top of that, then you are obviously chasing to the cheapest source of product and labor when margins are tight as well. So that is what is happening in Europe. Now, I mean, we have a few things we have to do. We want strategic autonomy across the entirety of Europe in terms of critical issues, energy security, medicines, food, and other things that are critical to the basic functionings of society. Our medicines issue has shown to be very weak in terms of supply chains and weak to or vulnerable to shocks. As I said, the Suez Canal shock alone, the COVID pandemic, and what we found out from that, how vulnerable we were. So we have to look at the generics industry and see, where we have driven the margins. And I'm not touting for an increased business for the pharmaceutical sector, but these are market facts that, just are inevitable. If we keep driving down the margins, something has to give. And that's what is given, in the sense that we have now shortages in key areas of critical medicines in the generic sector. And I just think that all our policies across industrial policy will have to look at how do we attract and re-incentivize the reshoring of active ingredients and also the manufacturing. And that will require, I think, centralized procurement, taking into account the obligation or the cost incurred by companies in terms of ensuring that they have enough medicines available, and that they will carry, we'll say, a certain percentage of inventory that would be there in the event of there being a shock. These are the things that we're going to have to look at if we want to be strategically autonomous in the areas of health. And Europe is a cold place in general in terms of medicines and medicine production and pharmaceutical sector. If we look at the number of clinical trials, for example, across Europe as well. So we really do have to reorientate our entire industrial policy from the innovative, high-end medicines and developments right across to the generic sector to ensure that we have that critical mass within the European Union. And bear in mind, we can do it. We did it in a very short space of time when it came to the COVID pandemic. Very quickly, we were able to ramp up production, shorten decision-making processes in the regulatory process, incentivize companies, and then they got on with it. But I mean, they got on with it because they had the capacity, they had been allowed by the regulatory decision-making process being speeded up. But on top of that, there was reward at the end of the day for their investment. And that is the key issue here that we have to look at from an industrial policy perspective, not just in medicines, but across the entirety of the industrial sector.
So while we're waiting to see what will come out of the Act, obviously, there have been some measures already introduced, including the voluntary solidarity mechanism, which is where EU countries can offer medicines to those that to other countries that are experiencing a shortage. Vanessa, how is that working at the moment? Is it being well used?
Okay, thank you. I suppose I have to give a nod to Gloria because this idea for a voluntary solidarity mechanism came from the member states through a proposal initiated by Belgium. And that the suggestion was to have this mechanism formalized so member states could identify where there were stocks when they were suffering from critical shortage of a medicine. So in October last year, the mechanism was developed, and that was EMA with the member state national competent authorities and the Commission identified this procedure that would be followed once a critical shortage was identified where the member states couldn't find a solution and where there could be potentially be stocks in another member state or through another source. So since that time, the mechanism has been launched 7 times. One is ongoing, but already the solution has been identified. For the remaining 6, they were all resolved within a reasonable time frame, I would say. I mean, I think with anything, initially identifying a smooth process, it took a little bit of time, but it's being improved each time it's being used. So I think in terms of success, it's intended to be a last resort solution. So it's intended to be when all other measures are considered and only to be used in very occasional instances, not a reliable source on an ongoing basis, let's say. But in terms of its success for the cases so far, it has really proven to be a very useful tool in the overall toolkit of the MSSG. Yeah, so hopefully it will continue to be used sparingly but successfully.
Thanks. Obviously, one of the ways that some countries are dealing with specific shortages is through stockpiling measures, which you referenced earlier. Germany and France have both come under fire from others, and I know there have been pushes by certain countries in the council to essentially trying to get them to stop doing that. Gloria, could you tell us what the knock-on effect is for other European countries when, one country decides to introduce quite a strict stockpiling measure? And also, does this suggest, there's a kind of move away from these, or by some countries from a joint approach? Do you see member states wanting to revert to a more national approach to this, or what's the general consensus?
Yes, thank you. My first reaction would be that member states have always thought very nationally when it comes to medicines, right? And when it comes to pharmaceutical markets. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges, not only when it comes to medicine shortages, but also when it comes to procuring new medicines and expensive medicines. And when you're talking about contracts. So this is something that in general, I would say that we are really struggling with. Secondly, yes, I think by now it's clear that the knock-on effects of stockpiling can be very severe for small countries. We are receiving some signals from the industry side that headquarters by now are deciding to first supply the stockpiles and then only to meet the patient needs in other countries. And the reason why is clear: these companies make an economic decision. I recently saw an article where in France, several companies received a fine that was running into the millions because they didn't fulfill their stockpiling obligation. So if a company then needs to make a decision between supplying the Belgian patient needs market or the French stockpiling obligation, this decision is quickly made because Belgium will never, ever deliver a fine of €1 million to a company. We are simply too small for that. And so, yes, the knock-on effects are very severe. I really think we need European measures here. I really think we need legal clarity that patient needs must come before stockpiling obligations, and that stockpiles must be built over a longer time. It's inevitable.
One question I would like to ask perhaps each of you actually, just because it's been something we've written about a lot here at Politico, is the feasibility of the 100-day Critical Medicines Act. Will it be complete within that time frame at the end of February? It's something that I think Commissioner Varhelyi's being asked quite a lot about, and he's doubled down frequently and said, yeah, this is definitely feasible, it's definitely achievable. Adrian, perhaps I can ask you first. Do you think that's achievable?
It's going to be very tight, but I think it is achievable. Actually, a lot of work has been done. This was actually kicked off under the Belgian presidency when 22 member states asked for a Critical Medicines Act. So it's not completely new. And there has been a lot of data and analysis put forward in the context of the Critical Medicines Alliance by member states, by industry, by stakeholders. So I think it is feasible to put forward a legislation. I think the real issue here is that the legislation will touch on some sensitive points. As Billy was pointing out, this is about reinvesting in manufacturing in Europe. That requires changes to how the European Union normally looks at these issues. As was mentioned, usually it would reject this kind of proposal as something against state aid rules. So this is about changing that way of thinking. Also, Gloria was mentioning the stockpiling issue, and we've had great cooperation with EMA and the MSSG and the predecessor to the MSSG, which was a committee that was set up during COVID. But the underlying problem we have is that we have a very murky and hard to read market in Europe because we have 27 member states. We have a number of manufacturers, intermediaries like wholesalers, hospitals. And the minute there's a whiff of panic of a shortage, okay, what happens is that either hospitals or wholesalers will start to hoard the medicines or sometimes even to trade the medicines. And we need to make more visible what's going on in the market so that governments can have trust that we can solve the shortage and limit this hoarding that we see going on in France and Germany right now. During COVID, we had hoarding between hospitals in one region in France against hospitals in another region in France. Well, the hospitals in the region without the stocks were the ones that had the high number of COVID patients. So obviously the medicines had to go there. For the amoxicillin shortage in 22-23, there was a lot. These are really the cheapest of the cheap medicines. There was so much speculation around these that the stocks were moving around all over the place in the European market. Nobody knew where they were anymore. So we need to do this. We have data in the EMVS, in the counterfeiting system for Europe, to try and get a grip as to what's going on. But we're not allowed to use it. Obviously, it should be authorities using it for competition law reasons. But still, we need to have more visibility to prevent this hoarding mentality, which unfortunately is spreading.
Thank you. Billy, do you think that the 100-day time frame that Commissioner Borrelli has set himself is realistic?
Well, look, it's necessary. It's very ambitious, obviously, but we'd like to see it get there. Look, we've had the pharmaceutical strategy around for a long period of time, with the Critical Medicines Act now, which is essential. And I think that, every effort should be made by Commissioner Borrelli and the Council as well to sort of push this forward now. But look, there's a sad reality, and it's a fact. But if there's going to be a shortage of medicines, there's no Minister for Health in any country across Europe is going to say, well, look, we sent the medicines to another country. These are political realities. So, until such time as we have proper centralized systems of knowing what's available, where it is, where it's stocked, putting obligations on companies to keep a certain amount of stock available, but that the stock isn't the first place they fill. They provide the medicines into the market first and to where it's needed, but then they also should be encouraged to keep a certain stock level as well in place. That costs money to keep stock in place. So, all these things will have to be looked at in terms of developing not just the Critical Medicines Act, but the broader industrial policy around stimulating and reinvigorating the space of manufacturing of generic drugs across Europe. But until such time as we address that issue, ministers and departments of health across Europe will stockpile, because no minister or no government will look their constituents in the eye and say, well, we give the medicines to another country first. That simply doesn't happen. And you can see those with the big might, the Frances and Germanys and others, will stockpile, and countries that may have a critical amount of manufacturing in their jurisdiction, they also can leverage a political pressure on companies to make sure that they, look after their own country first. That is, very distasteful from the point of view of we trying to build a European Union of equals, but they are the political realities of having 27 countries.
Gloria, do you think the act by the end of February or early March is realistic?
Really, I don't know. And honestly, even though this idea came from the Belgian presidency, I don't overly care when it's launched, but it should be launched at the right moment. And this means that it should be launched before the next MFF cycle, that's for sure. But I also think that many of the discussions that we are having in the Critical Medicines Act are also tied to the general discussions that we are having with the Draghi report. The state aid rules will be revised in any case. This is what Draghi asks from Europe, right? And so we should make sure that this act doesn't come too early, but also that it doesn't come too late, but that it comes at the right moment to make sure that the state aid rules also serve the purpose of the act. And I think that's the most important part, actually.
Thank you. And Vanessa, what about you? Do you think it's an achievable goal?
I'm not sure I can comment on how achievable it is, but for me, what's important is the complementarity with the proposed pharmaceutical legislation and also a robust evidence base behind what's included. I think they're the key components to ensure a good and clear Critical Medicines Act that can deliver for patients and for health systems.
Thanks. We're running kind of close to time now, but I'm going to go with one potentially final question from from the Slido that seems to be the most popular, which is, what is the real impact of Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive on medicines access? Has this been thought through? Perhaps I can go to Adrian for that one.
Yeah, so maybe people are probably wondering what this has to do with medicine, but basically there's a new directive that states that due to the human consumption of medicine and then the release of waste from humans into the sewer water, there will have to be a fee on the consumption of medicines paid by the medicines industry based on the volume of medicines sold. So it's sort of like a tax on medicines consumption, I guess. I think the problem with this is that the volume of medicine sold is largely very inexpensive legacy, meaning older generic medicines, maybe for use in diabetes or anti-infectives like antibiotics or cardio medicines. And these are, because they're consumed in big volumes, they're sold at a very, very low price. And the impact of these fees, which is estimated to be 1.2 billion, maybe it's 1.6 or 1.8 billion, or maybe it's even higher than that, we don't know yet, is going to largely fall on these very inexpensive legacy drugs. And it's quite clear that a big chunk of the cost is going to fall on them. And it's not at all clear that these drugs can survive in many member state markets with the fee, because generic medicine prices are capped, are fixed, so you cannot increase them. They're just set at that level, and that's the price that they stay at. So there would have to be kind of a considerable change to national medicines purchasing policies for this to actually be feasible going forward, at least for those legacy generic medicines, which are the main ones that patients consume today.
Okay, thanks for that. So yeah, I think we've run out of time now. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much to each of our participants for joining us for the discussion. I think it's all given us some food for thought. We'd just like to take a quick look at the results of the poll. So as you might remember, the question was, do you believe the current systemic framework applied to the generics industry is sustainable and effectively ensures the availability and accessibility of medicines for patients across the EU? no seems to be the answer. I think it's 77%. Don't have my glasses on. Yeah, thank you very much to our speakers for joining us. You, the audience at home, for your questions too, and finally to our partner Zentiva for making this event possible. Thanks so much.
We are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
And looking ahead to what is next.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?